but you're talking about protests, and we've been talking obviously about the student protests right now and the ways that they're being criminalized. But we have to kind of go back, and you have these two excellent articles. The War on Protest is here, which is then based on, I think is it your Grist article or your Type Investigations piece?
The Grist piece looks more specifically at the anti-pipeline movement and the government's response to both Keystone and Standing Rock.
Exactly. So lay that out for us. Like, how did the FBI begin? Like, they've been preying on Indigenous people and activists since their foundation, the FBI's foundation. But how did Keystone XL like create this blueprint of surveillance and repression?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really interesting in the context of what's happening right now, especially with calls by both Democratic and Republican lawmakers for the FBI to investigate student groups and protesters on campuses across the country. I mean, we had Nancy Pelosi in January calling for the FBI to get involved. And I feel like every week there's sort of a new insistence that the FBI get on the case, which is sort of ironic because they are already deeply involved in monitoring and keeping tabs on domestic political actors, and they have been throughout the history of the organization.
Yep.
But what we've learned about Keystone through Freedom of Information Act requests over the years is that they were focusing on Native American groups and activists in the very, very early days of that campaign. Back in 2012, before the Keystone Pipeline had really emerged as a national issue, the FBI was targeting Native groups and activists in South Dakota. And then about 11 months later, opened another investigation into a group called Tar Sands Blockade that was organizing against the pipeline in Texas and actually established a tree sit on the property of a landowner there. But throughout these documents, you really see the way that the FBI characterizes nonviolent direct action as a potentially violent threat. A lot of the records are characterized as domestic terrorism investigations. And this kind of framing, I think, is something that we see through Black Lives Matter, Cop City, and now, of course, with the protests against the war in Gaza, the easiest reaction from lawmakers is to sort of lump them all in this category of, as Tom Cotton likes to say, pro-Hamas mobs and domestic extremists and terrorists.
Little Gazas was our favorite here.
Yeah, I mean, it's obscene. But I think that this kind of language and rhetoric, repeated enough, it does start to shape not just the discourse, but the way that law enforcement responds to these movements.
And in terms of Keystone XL, they started tracking people. They started tracking groups like 350.org, you write. But ultimately, it was, the project was tanked in part thanks to the Obama administration. Was he just spying on people so he could figure out how to cater to them?
I mean, I think it's partly just the nature of the FBI.
I'm obviously joking. I know that the answer is no. But I am curious about like how then, because I came up in 2000 around like the middle of the global justice movement, right? Popped off in Seattle, 99. And then around 2000, I think it was 3 when the World Trade Organization Miami protest happened, or the WTO came to Miami. And everyone was ready, and everyone's like, we're going to dress up as turtles like we do. And we're going to have like, be in those sumo suits. And it was like really cute because global justice protests were like adorable and full of like, colorful things and whatnot. And then it was tanks. It was tanks in the street. A friend of mine got a rubber bullet to her head. And it was like, oh, we're in a new territory. Everything's changed. And so it's interesting to see each movement, no matter what it's around, global justice, anti-pipeline, that there's like sort of this culling of information and then a moment where they're like, now we're just going to fully repress. But can you be explicit? Like, what are the different versions of repression and how did that play out, let's say, in Standing Rock years after Keystone?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, we really saw that evolution with the campaign against Keystone and then the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock. The response to that protest was markedly different from anything that we had seen in the Keystone XL pipeline campaign. And it was partly, I think, because of both the success of the Keystone campaign. I mean, Obama rejected the northern part of the pipeline in 2015. And I think for industry, that was a really a wake-up call that they had to crack down on any subsequent protests, because otherwise you might see, success build on itself. And I think the Standing Rock campaign started out slowly. I mean, I think people remember sort of when everyone flooded to North Dakota in late 2016, 2017, but it started out very small with these spirit camps and just small numbers of people, blossomed into this mass movement with thousands of people, and elicited a truly terrifying response, both from the North Dakota State Police, FBI, which we've recently learned had up to 10 informants on the ground at Standing Rock.
At least that feels low. Sorry, but yes, you're the journalist. I'm just
that's just a recent deposition. But there's informants. They were at in the Keystone campaign. We know that the FBI ramped up its program to spy on Muslim Americans after 9/11. And I think in some ways, we really do have to understand the history of the agency if we want to understand, what's happening right now in terms of the response to protests on college campuses and why the reaction has been so visceral and punitive.
Yeah, getting specific, and Kate, please feel free to jump in anywhere. I'll just ask this question and shut up. But get specific, because I think when people sort of don't really understand what FBI infiltration or can look like, but you do talk about Red Fawn Fallis, I think is their name, a Lakota activist who was at Standing Rock, who actually was in a romantic relationship with someone who turned out to be an informant, which is, for those who don't know, that's a tactic. That is 1,000,000% a tactic.
Shockingly common.
Mm-hmm. But it is a tactic of that infiltrator to gain trust, to sleep with people, which again can be its own
to have children with them. In the UK, the Metropolitan Police, it's an absolutely eye-opening history, and it is in some ways what got me started on this reporting more than 10 years ago.
Oh yeah,
the infiltration of social movements in the UK and deliberately cultivating romantic relationships with activists to embed themselves in these movements, and then it's really sordid. But it is, you're absolutely right that it is a tactic that they use.
That's crazy. That would be so horrible to that would be almost worse than finding out that your partner was cheating on you, to find out that this whole time they've just been trying to collect. I guess it's way worse than cheating, because if your partner cheats on you, you don't end up in jail, I guess.
And they're not an FBI agent or an agent of the police state.
No, it's awful. And I think that I do want to talk about how it kind of got turbocharged, because remember, Keystone this surveillance happened under Obama, and then Standing Rock happened under Trump, and then something else happened under Trump, which was the 2020 BLM movement and this massive repression. And how did the criminalization of protests get turbocharged during BLM? What were some of the measures that were passed in different states? Yeah.
I think there were a few things that happened under Trump and the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of George Floyd and several others. One is we saw a new wave of anti-protest legislation that focused on criminalizing or enhancing penalties for blocking traffic. And that's something that we're seeing again right now in response to the protests against the war in Gaza. And some of these laws are in New York State, for example, lawmakers have proposed, making blocking traffic or a highway an act of domestic terrorism. So they are.
I blocked traffic in 2003 to stop the Iraq War, and it was a misdemeanor. It was just, nothing. And now those are being called felonies, correct?
In many places, they're
or terrorism.
And that's the felonies or terrorism, and that's sort of the transformation that we've seen take place over the last decade and a half. But at the same time, in 2020, you had with the Trump administration in office, a ratcheting up of the kind of rhetoric that demonizes and paints protesters as violent extremists, from Antifa to Black Lives Matter, and giving license to both law enforcement and to lawmakers to take, the kind of draconian actions that they've taken in response to these movements. So I think that it created a much more hostile environment, and we can talk. Yeah,
but anti-maskers can storm a capitol, like state capitals, take them over with, well, they've got guns. I mean, or like what happened on January 6th is like, we don't call the rioters, we never call them terrorists, ever. Have you ever heard? I mean, maybe initially after Jan 6th, there was like, people started calling it domestic terrorism, but that still wasn't ever called that, which again, you have to look at the ways the FBI has ultimately said that actually one of the greatest threats to national security is homegrown terrorism, i.e. white people.
Mm-hmm.
But are they seriously internally putting environmental anti-pipeline activists on the same footing? Or is this all for show and to like give cops a bunch of money?
Cops have certainly gotten a lot of money out of it, particularly in Minnesota. But I mean, the FBI has clearly said that environmental extremism is one of the number one domestic terror threats since the early 2000s. I mean, right up there with Al-Qaeda, even though, I mean, the environmental movement has been committed to nonviolent direct action for decades, and no one, to my knowledge, has ever been killed, let alone injured, because of an environmental activist. So the equation, I mean, I think obviously
just a pocketbook was hurt and a construction was delayed for a couple days, right?
Absolutely. Are you taking on the fossil fuel industry? I mean, they have immense power. And that's another piece of this, which is that the industry works very closely with law enforcement, including the FBI. It's not as if these institutions are working independently of each other. I have a document from 2012, which is a FBI Trans-Canada training session in Oklahoma. I mean, the document has the FBI and Trans-Canada's logos on the letterhead. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Wow.
So it's clear whose interests they're serving and protecting.
Right. And a lot of it is privately paid for, right? So like you talk about how like if the company is also shelling out for like the state police or the troopers or whomever, like the cities must be like, okay, fine, you're paying for it, cool.
Yeah, it shapes the response, because if the oil company is going to pick up the tab, then why not call in extra extra troops or
get
law
another
enforcement
tank
to do. Yeah, get another tank, get some more equipment to handle these. We saw that really with Line 3 in Minnesota, and part of it is that civil disobedience does delay these projects, and it is expensive, and that's the point, obviously, from the perspective of the campaigns that are protesting these pipelines. But I think in Minnesota, Enbridge, the company building that pipeline, spent over $8 million in an escrow account to cover all the different costs related to pipeline construction, and a lot of that was policing.
So fucking dystopian, Kate. Like we live in a time when like protesters are like throwing down with native activists, please let's save it, and then it's just like this militarized police force being like, we will build a fucking pipeline, and it's like destroy. It's so like you can't write it better. It's so creepy.
Or a police training facility, right?
Or like exactly. Well, Cop City, I think, is next, right? We because Cop City truly is the sort of marriage of these movements, that these industries that we're fighting, and these movements that are coalescing around, a reform of policing. And then environmental activism, as Cop City will destroy so much of this forest outside of Atlanta. And these activists have now been hit. How many? Like dozens of them have been hit with RICO charges for things as small as distributing literature. So what does this, what's the impact? How the people you've spoken to or research on, how do have their lives been upended because of these things?
Totally upended. I mean, from individual activists who now face both domestic terrorism and racketeering charges, which carry really stiff penalties, 20 to 25 years in prison, fines, and then to have the domestic terrorism charge hanging over you for the rest of your life is no minor thing.
Yeah. It just seems like, to me, like, it seems like they're going to go very, very hard for the next few years on all this stuff, because, like, as these like social movements are starting to build steam, like, it seems like the goal is to just really make the consequences so bad that nobody wants to be an activist anymore.
Right. Which is funny, because doesn't that sound a little bit like all of the, failed states we like to finger wag at? Oh,
Yeah.
you can't even have safe protest. Ooh, look at Iran. They're locking women up. Really, dude? Have you checked out what's happening here?
Yeah, take a look at Atlanta. I mean, it's actually over 60 activists are caught up in that RICO charge, which is unprecedented. And that law has never been used to go after social movements. I mean, it was originally passed.
That's such a Rubicon that's been crossed, man.
It is. And I think a lot of attorneys and activists, I mean, they're watching it closely. And even if the charges don't stick, they do feel like it is a turning point just in giving states the, state governors and prosecutors the option to use these laws, whether it's domestic terrorism, RICO, or other. I saw the AG in Ohio wrote a letter to university administrators saying that he was planning to use a 1953 anti-masking law to threaten campus protesters with potential felonies. So, they'll use anything they can to undermine these movements and to scare people into, returning to their dorm rooms and locking the door, basically.
I mean,
yeah.
It's just, yeah.
But ultimately it fails, I think.
Well, right. You mean, I think that with the Keystone XL and, I mean, Standing Rock to a lesser degree, I'm like trying to remember exactly what the fallout of Standing Rock was. Did they there was a stand down of the company?
Standing Rock was complicated in part it dovetailed with Trump's election, and he basically rubber stamped it on his first day in office, and he also green-lighted the Keystone pipeline. So that, it sort of...
That then Biden reversed again.
Yeah, but Standing Rock, I mean, that pipeline is in the, it's operational. It was I think hundreds of activists got arrested, but they were still at that time largely misdemeanor charges. There's still a lot we don't really know about just how involved the FBI was.
Right. But I mean, it's like we're old enough to remember and see what happened in, Charlottesville, and see like these like white guys with tiki torches, like no one was doing shit to them. They're literally chanting "Jews will not replace us." No one doing shit to stop that. And yet now you see people naming a building after a 6-year-old who was murdered in her car, and they're the enemies, supposedly. Like, just, it is so dissonant. I mean, so again, it's such a radicalizing moment, but as you document, it's so much harder and harder, and it is so much more brave and courageous to be taking the streets now than it ever has been. I mean, I do want to ask you quickly about the DeRay McKesson case. So DeRay McKesson was like a BLM leader-ish, spokesperson-ish. And he had I guess SCOTUS declined to hear his case, but can you just explain that significance of this case?
Yeah, it's a big deal. I mean, McKesson was a prominent Black Lives Matter organizer, in some ways became the public face of that movement, and was involved in a lot of the organizing efforts around different actions. And this particular protest was, I think it was 2016 in Baton Rouge, and it was to commemorate the death of Alton Sterling, a Black man who'd been shot and killed down there. Anyway, McKesson was at this protest. Somebody threw a rock and it hit a law enforcement officer in the face, and he was injured. Long story short, the officer sued McKesson and is trying to hold him liable for the actions of this other individual.
Right.
And you can imagine what that would do to anyone who is involved in organizing. So the Fifth Circuit Court, which is stacked with Trump judges, actually upholds this lawsuit, and it goes to this, which effectively affirming the the argument that the law enforcement officer is making, and the Supreme Court recently declined to hear that case, which means that for now it is effectively the law of the land.
So that if someone does something at a protest that you helped organize that injures somebody, you can be directly held liable for it.
You could be held liable. And as an aside, this is actually something that we're seeing in a lot of this anti-protest legislation, that provisions that hold organizations responsible for actions that protesters take.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, what's interesting about that, and is that, we saw, and you see a lot of the student protesters now having de-escalatory tactics that are used on counter demonstrators, right? They never fight back, even though if they're attacked, and they do something, they create like sort of a wall around a counter demonstrator where they can, almost like a free speech zone inside the free speech zone, where they can sort of say whatever they want, but you're going to be surrounded so that there is no like scuffle between you and anybody else. And it's almost like protest movements, and we all, organizers who are hearing this know what I'm talking about. That's why you have your own security. That's why you have medics. That's why you have National Lawyers Guild folks watching, because you fucking know no one's going to protect you. The cops won't. There's going to be no lawyers to protect you. And there will be counter demonstrators in your fucking face who will be trying to instigate something. And so you have to do everything you can to keep everybody safe. It's like basically protesters are doing the job that the state should be doing.
You guys were talking about infiltrators earlier. Like, one thing I've thought about with this legislation is literally all you have to do if you want to, put the organizers of a protest in jail or stop a protest movement, just send one infiltrator to do something really bad.
Yep.
I think that we've probably seen a lot of that happen so far. Like, these pro-Palestine protests, I don't know for sure, but there have been instances of like, pro-Israel, protesters, like, one person who said she got stabbed in the eye. I watched the video. Did not appear to me to be an eye stabbing in any way.
It was not an eye stabbing.
Yeah, and it's just like all they really have to do is, send somebody in to either do something violent or claim something violent happened to them.
And it's interesting in the context of all this discussion about so-called outside agitators. Who really are the outside agitators? You look at the history of the FBI and the role of informants in disrupting social movements, counter protesters at UCLA, upending this peaceful, nonviolent encampment. So it really sort of is on the media to help to explain what's really happening out there, because these narratives take hold and they really are misleading.
Yeah. And also, by the way, fuck these informants. Sometimes they get paid shit. Can you imagine being such a fucking low-life scum? Now I'm just going to go off and get paid like, $200 a week, you fucking sucker. Like seriously, some of these informants who are like in the Muslim community, it's rampant. They get no money. The FBI doesn't give a shit about them. They get no money to rat out some innocent person. Cowards, awful people.
Don't they do like a lot of people too, like that? I'm not talking about like this issue specifically, but like, isn't there kind of, a tradition of using people who have charges against them and
1,000,000%.
basically saying like, hey, like, we're going to either put you in jail for the rest of your life, or you can rat out a few of your friends.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Putin's so evil because he does that except with hackers, and he like gives them a choice, which like at least you're teaching them a skill. You know what I'm saying? At least it's like something beneficial. Learn to code and crime for me. No, I think some of them were hackers, but to begin with, but it's just like, anyway, any final thoughts, Adam, before we let you go? This has been incredible. And we're going to link to your articles because they're chilling and important.
I would just say we've already seen many new laws proposed in response to the, campus protests against the war in Gaza, and even just to protests that were taking place before then. So this is now the playbook, and any mass movement, any movement that threatens the status quo, especially when it comes to foreign policy, is going to be greeted with an entirely new sort of legal assault on the right to gather and protest. So it's something that we all certainly need to pay attention to.
Right. Until the Nazis do it. And then it's fine.
It also doesn't seem like something that's ever likely to be rolled back to me. Like, it seems like it would be very difficult to change these laws.
But that's why, I mean, I think that's why I think it's really important to just sort of like say that all of this is about whether directly or indirectly protecting business. And, whenever, obviously there's cops outside of businesses, number one, when there's a protest, because they're protecting property. Number two, if you've like interrupted a commute, by shutting down a bridge, how dare you? This is interrupting commerce. And then more directly, you cannot interrupt the free flow of oil and gas, because oil is a person and they have personhood rights. You person, people, many millions of people, no rights, zero rights. So like it takes all these different forms, and I think it's maybe people are not in, like, I think that's important to remind everybody, is that like if your day is inconvenienced by a demonstrator, like it's all good, take a load off. You're gonna rush to work to like work for your boss? No.
I mean, the traffic thing really gets Republicans upset, blocking roads.
They hate it. It's like the worst thing that could ever happen.
It goes against everything that it means to be American, I think.
Have they heard of the West Bank? Like, can you imagine? I love that they're also like, oh yeah, what if there's an ambulance? It's like, they're literally, anyway, they're protesting an occupation that holds up.
Yeah, well, then, and if New York passes this law, anyone who blocks traffic will be a domestic terrorist. So we can look forward to that, I suppose.
What if it's blocked just because I look pretty,
Well, what if you literally stop traffic because you're so hot?
What if we just get some hot babes for a cause? We put them in front of the traffic. Not absolutely. To get hit.
I think that's a perfect solution, actually. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.